I'm Matt Smith, and you're listening to the True North Country Comics Podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics Podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book creators and supporters. It's August 6, 2020. I'm John Swinimer. If you have a comment, criticism, or question, you can contact me at john@truenorthcountrycomics.com. On this episode, I chat with Matt Smith. The podcast is available on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts. Matt is a Canadian-British cartoonist, filmmaker, and educator. He's lived all over the world in countries like Malaysia, Japan, and Kuwait. He currently lives in Glasgow, Scotland, where he continues to create comics and facilitate comic workshops. Matt has taken his comics workshops to schools, comic conventions, and art galleries in North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. In May 2018, Matt facilitated a panel on creating comics at the Vancouver Comic Arts Festival with fellow cartoonist Ryan Howe. Matt's best known for his humorous, autobiographical Smith vs. Smith comics, which can be found online at SmithVsSmith.com and on the Tapas app and in the Comixology and Comic Central online stores. You can also buy Smith vs. Smith comics in bookstores across Canada and the UK. Matt's comics typically focus on travel, the ups and downs of modern relationships, and the joys and frustrations of cat ownership. So, without further ado, here's my chat with Matt Smith. Matt Smith, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for reaching out.
I appreciate it. What I normally do to start off the conversation is ask the creator about their first comic book. So I'm wondering if you remember, what was the first comic book that you read?
Yeah, comics were always kind of just around. I spent my entire life living overseas, so it was kind of hard to get new books. But I just always remember my dad's English, and his sisters, my aunts, would send us the Beano and the Dandy to me and my brother. These great British comics that I think Beano's the only one still in publication, but it was a weekly comic that would come out. So I would get those sent overseas, and I think I would save them up. So like monthly we could get like 4 at once, and it was really exciting. And my aunts are lovely and very sweet, and I got those delivered way too long. Like, we were way too old for them, that I didn't have the heart to tell my lovely aunts, like, hey, these are a bit below me now. So finally we were like, yeah, thanks so much. It's been a wonderful, 10 years. But we always had those, and that had the British Dennis the Menace. And my favorite strip was the Bass Street Kids. There was this whole school full of the worst class in Britain, and they were all too cool to obey any rules and do whatever they wanted. And then my Canadian uncles had Calvin and Hobbes collection. So we had Calvin and Hobbes books. And I remember growing up, it really bugged me that it seemed like the stories were out of order, because Watterson would do several strips in a row of Calvin coming home from school and getting attacked by Hobbes. And I was like, wait, that doesn't make sense. He's had a whole day in between. So I would photocopy them and then cut them out and put the strips back into proper order, where you would see him come home and then have his afternoon and then wake up the next day and just have them in kind of sequential day order. But those two were the ones that I really remember the most. And then Ninja Turtle comics, and then getting into Batman comics, and just more and more as they became more available overseas.
Right. So I wanted to ask you, based on all that, who or what inspires you to create your art today?
Yeah, in terms of artists, I started by making movies when I was a kid, and I got into Quentin Tarantino movies. So suddenly all my movies were starring my high school friends, dressed in suits, wearing glasses with thin ties, and making these gangster movies with a bunch of pimply-faced teenagers. But then I discovered Kevin Smith movies, and he was just making movies about him and his friends hanging out, and people like his friends just talking about the stuff they were into, and that opened a whole new world. So I started just making movies about people my age talking about stuff that we talked about, and that I think has carried through to my autobiographical comics. And then when I was in university at the University of Victoria, this was after I went to film school and was now going to university, the Vancouver Art Gallery had this exhibit, Crazy, with a K, and it was a comics exhibit curated by Seth, and it had all of these cartoonists that Seth was into and a lot of his original stuff, and just this realization that comics can be, very realistic and autobiographical and kind of memoir, and just very, very realistic stuff. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can make comics about just my life. And that's when I started to publish comics in the University of Victoria's Martlet student paper. And that really opened my eyes to what comics can be. They didn't have to be, a genre. It could be this sort of, again, realistic, sort of just down to earth, true, very honest, very heartfelt, very realistic stories. And so Seth has been a huge influence on me, and Jeffrey Brown, his autobiographical stories, Guy Delisle with his travelogue stories have been fantastic. And then in terms of like content and story wise, my favorite comics are autobiographical. So really my wife and my cats are like my muses. And every time my wife says something ridiculous, I'll just make a note on my phone and then show it to her later in comic form. And sometimes she'll laugh. Sometimes she's like, I didn't say that. I'm like, yeah, you did. I wrote it down. I remember you said it in the moment. And, if the cats are doing something that would make me go crazy and tear my hair out, instead of getting upset, I would just turn it into a comic and kind of vent my frustrations at cat ownership through the comics. So content-wise, pulling from life, but in terms of cartoonists, Seth and other autobiographical cartoonists like that.
Great. I was going through some of the various conventions that unfortunately were canceled, and I noticed that you were planning to attend the Lakes International Comics Art Festival in the UK. So I'm wondering, what were you planning to exhibit at that particular show?
Yeah, so I just kickstarted my first full-length graphic novel. So a couple years ago, I had taken a break from comics for a couple different reasons, but then when my wife and I became engaged, we sent out like a 2-page comic about our engagement, kind of talking about how we met and how I proposed. And then as we were planning the wedding over the next year, I turned it into this 60-page little comic booklet that became our keepsake from the wedding. So instead of getting chocolates or cakes, everyone got a little comic about us and how we met and fell in love, and how she tricked me into getting 2 cats when I always said I would never date a woman who had cats, and how I got really drunk the night before I proposed and spent the day more hungover than I ever have been, but still managed to rally and propose, and everything leading up to the wedding. And then I turned it into this kind of full-length graphic novel called You're Stuck With Me Now. And I sent it out to publishers, didn't really hear anything back, and I kind of have been sitting on it for a while. And then when everything kind of shut down in the world, I was like, okay, enough's enough. I'm going to get this book out there. So I put it all together, finished it, and kickstarted it. And it was really important to me to do a Kickstarter. I feel like it's kind of a cartoonist rite of passage sometimes to successfully fund a Kickstarter. So I was really excited that it was, more successful than I could have imagined. And my whole plan was to fund a print run that I would be able to take to conventions. And I was hoping to go to some in Canada this summer and go to the convention circuit in the UK, and obviously that's not happening, so I have copies ready to go, but it's the true story of how I met my Scottish wife while we were both living in Kuwait. So it's got, a bit of clash of cultures, clash of personalities, and a little bit of travel stuff, and just, 2 people trying to make a life work together and try to, come together and learn how to survive with each other and for each other.
Cool. So you mentioned that you traveled a fair bit. I'm wondering if you've met any other Canadian creators in your convention travels.
Yeah, I've done Vancap a few years in a row. I'm always on the wait list for 3 years in a row, and even last year I was on the wait list until the last minute, and I kind of decided, okay, I'm not going to exhibit this year. I'll just go as a visitor. And then I've got the email on Thursday night that I was going to be able to exhibit on Saturday, so I just scrambled to get my books together. And met a bunch of people that are really great, but one story that was very memorable, I knew that Pia Youre was going to be there, the co-creator of Why the Last Man, which is one of my favorite series of all time. And I think it starts out strong and it just ends strong, and it's just so powerful still. And I knew she was going to be there. And so even though, we were filling the car with my books to sell, I was like, I have to make space in the car for all 9 volumes of Why the Last Man. And I went up to her and I was like, hey, it's my favorite series. Can I bother you to sign all 9 copies? And she was like, yeah, of course. And then while she signed them, I was like, hey, every time I meet someone who I enjoy their work, I like to give them a copy of my book. So I had a collection of my SmithVsSmith autobiographical comics called There's Plenty of Emmas in the World, based off something my mother-in-law said about my wife, which I thought was just so ridiculous I had to make it the title. So I gave her a copy of There's Plenty of Emmas in the World. And her husband, Ian Boothby, leans over because he was exhibiting as well, and he was like, oh, where do you have that book? And I was like, oh. And he was like, yeah, our daughter is named Emma, and we saw it at Golden Age Collectibles downtown Vancouver yesterday, so we picked it up. And I was like, oh, cool. I'll be right back. And so I walked away casually and then ran back into the gym where my wife and I were exhibiting, and I ran up to Emma and I was like, give me another book. She's like, what? I'll tell you later. Something really cool's happening. And I grabbed another book, my Three Crushes book, and I ran back and then kind of stopped running, within eyesight, and walked casually over and just said, oh, that's cool that you already have this. Here's another one that, you might enjoy as well. That's cool. So that was pretty exciting.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, I want to switch gears slightly and talk about your creation process. Can you walk me through how you go from initial concept to the finished page?
Yeah, I'm in the middle of working on something now. Again, everything's kind of changed. Everyone's home a bit more, so I've been trying to take advantage of that. And I'm working on a new graphic novel called Earth Shattering about my time in Tokyo during the 2011 earthquake, the massive earthquake that shook Japan. Mm-hmm. And I was teaching at the time, so it's during the actual earthquake. I was in a classroom with my students, and at the same time, I was going through a prolonged sort of breakup with my girlfriend at the time, and it wasn't really working out. So it kind of ties in the two storylines of, the ground being uneven underneath your feet in, a literal and a figurative sense. But I'm approaching it kind of like 2 pages at a time, because I know if I really think about how much work this graphic novel is going to be, I'll just never start, and it'll just completely overwhelm me. So I'm really kind of approaching it as, 2-page mini comics at a time. So I'm trying to write up a script. It's based off of a short story that I wrote. So I have the structure and I have it written out, and then I'm turning that into scripted pages, and then I'll do rough thumbnails, and then I've been doing pencils, but I'm only working at kind of an A4 size because I know it'll be sort of a shrunken down digest size in the end. So I'm not bothering to draw kind of tabloid size, because I think that'll just take more time. I'm trying to do this quickly and efficiently and trick my brain into making it, less of this huge obstacle and a bit of a more fun process. But I'll do pencils, then I'll ink on my light box, and then I scan into Photoshop, and then I'll do a lot of touch-ups and a lot of redrawing, and then I send it out to a few friends and get feedback, and I'll completely redraw some page, completely redraw some panels, and just do whatever it takes, and really not trying to force myself to stick to, a very confining process, because I want to kind of recapture that sense of fun and play that I had on that first graphic novel before I kind of did my research and kind of realized what the proper steps should be. So I'm trying to trick my brain back to, regressing to that sort of sense of play and fun, but it's kind of whatever it takes for each page. So some pages I've got these artist models that I've set up, and I've taken photos, and I've built sort of these cardboard classrooms, kind of like sets, his massive cities that he does on a very, very more, rough, small scale. And I'm doing photo reference, and then I'm like tracing over that with my pencils and just doing anything I can, really. So like each page is kind of its own creation process, and I'm allowing that to be okay. I'm giving myself that permission to kind of figure it out and reinvent it for each page. So it is kind of all over the place right now, but I'm enjoying that, and I like that it's going to be this weird sort of mishmash of different processes.
Sounds cool. You've taught at many conferences about comics, and I'm wondering if you have one piece of advice that you pass along to anyone who's thinking about making a comic book.
Yeah, I always say, like, just start. I mean, you'll learn so much just from making that first comic, and, whether you completely change your process or develop it or adapt it or whatever, you just learn so much from actually making that first comic, and you'll never make the next one until you make the first one, and you'll never figure out anything until you make something and you show it to someone and get the feedback and see, okay, this works, this doesn't work. So I always just say, like, let's just make something. Just, I get so many people come up to me at conventions because I do have a series of instructional books, and I do teach workshops, and, what should I do? So just make something, and then at least you have something to talk about. Oh, this didn't work. Oh, this totally worked. I like this. Or this wasn't, this part was fun. This part wasn't fun. So I always say, just make your first one, and then you'll figure everything else out from there.
That's good advice. Get started. Get your foot in the door.
Yeah.
Cool.
Put something down on paper.
Yeah. Now, you've talked a bit about some of the projects you have on the go, the graphic novel. Do you have anything else that you'd like to talk about that'll be coming out in the near future?
My main gig is visiting schools and running comics making workshops. So not only at conventions, and I've done a few teaching conferences, but my main gig has been visiting schools in person all over the world. And that's kind of been a bit tricky in the last semester, but I've been taking my lessons online. So I've been running workshops online for schools, but also for different art galleries and art centers and things. So if anyone's listening that wants to, run a comics making workshop or bring me in virtually or in person when things open up a bit more, that is my main drive, my main passion. And I really do enjoy running these workshops. It's really cool seeing just the range of stories and the range of art styles. And you can find out more about that on my website. It's SmithVsSmith.com/workshops-lessons. So if anyone's listening that wants, to get in touch about comics making workshops, please do get in touch, because I'm very proud that I have been able to take it online and kind of replicate that sort of interactiveness that I really sell when I'm there in person. And I've found ways to work around the limitations of being virtual, and I've seen some really great stuff, even though it hasn't been in person.
And you mentioned your website, but do you have any other online presence where people can find you?
Yeah, for sure. So my main website is SmithVsSmith.com. So that's SmithVsSmith.com, and there you can find links to all my other social medias and the specific website for the workshops. But I'm on Instagram very often at SmithVsSmith Comics. I'm on Facebook as well at SmithVsSmith Comics, and I'm on Twitter at SmithVsSmith. So Instagram and Facebook I'm on more than Twitter, but you can reach me on all three.
Great. Well, Matt, those are all the questions I have for you, but I'm wondering if there's something I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview.
One thing that I've really enjoyed in the last couple of months, with everyone being just so isolated, is the power of comics to kind of reach out and to create shared experiences. And I've really, really hit the power of comics as memoir and as a way of sharing personal narrative. And I think now more than ever, it's just really cool to see people make connections through art and through comics. And I think it's really powerful. People that are sharing their personal stories right now during this quarantine, a time where we're all feeling very isolated and very separated and alone. And the way that these comics, for me personally, some of the ones that I'm reading are making me feel connected. So Jason Turner, who's on Instagram at Vinegar22, is writing quarantine comics, and he's based in Vancouver. And for me, being all the way in Glasgow, Scotland, it's really been great having, a man on the ground kind of sharing the experiences of what things are like, daily life in Vancouver during this quarantine, because I'm feeling, very isolated and cut off from my family. But he's really kind of given me, the report from the ground, and he's passing by, recognizable Vancouver landmarks. So it's really making me feel connected to another one of my home cities, my former hometown, during this time where I just physically can't visit it. So I do really like that we have comics to kind of help us get through this.
Thanks to Matt for the chat. You can discover more about Matt on Twitter at SmithVsSmith and online at SmithVsSmith.com. And thanks to you for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts, and please leave a good rating. Please check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website and follow along on Twitter at TrueNorthComics. Please send your feedback to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. Thanks again for listening, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics Podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2020.